Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime storytelling series for sleeping. Let's go. Story 1, The Butcher Baker of Alaska, the hunter becomes hunted. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where the aurora borealis paints the sky in ethereal greens, and the silence can be so complete it feels alive, a different kind of hunter stalked his prey. This is the story of Robert Hansen, a man whose double life was so perfectly constructed that for over a decade, he committed some of the most chilling crimes in American history while maintaining the facade of a respectable, small-town businessman. Known as the Butcher Baker, Hansen's tale is one of deception, violence, and the ultimate hunt where human beings became the quarry. The story begins not in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, but in the small farming community of Pocahontas, Iowa, where Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939. From the outside, his childhood appeared unremarkable, but beneath the surface, dark currents were already beginning to form. Hansen was a slight, awkward child who struggled with a severe stutter that made him the target of relentless bullying at school. His father, a Danish immigrant who worked as a baker, was a domineering figure who demanded perfection and showed little patience for his son's perceived weaknesses. The young Hansen found solace in two activities that would later define his criminal career: hunting and archery. In the vast cornfields and woodlands surrounding Pocahontas, he developed an almost supernatural skill with a bow and arrow. While other children played games or socialized, Hansen spent countless hours perfecting his marksmanship, learning to track animals, and studying their behavior patterns. What began as a hobby would eventually become an obsession that extended far beyond wildlife. His relationship with women was troubled from an early age. The stutter that plagued his speech, combined with severe acne that scarred his face, made him painfully self-conscious. He was rejected repeatedly by girls his age, experiences that fed a growing resentment and sense of inadequacy that would fester for decades. In Hansen's mind, these rejections were not simply the normal awkwardness of adolescence, but deliberate humiliations that demanded eventual retribution. After graduating from high school, Hansen briefly attended college before dropping out and joining the Army Reserve. Even in military service, he failed to find the respect and acceptance he craved. Fellow soldiers recalled him as a loner who seemed to harbor deep-seated anger beneath his quiet exterior. It was during this period that Hansen committed his first serious crime, setting fire to a school bus garage in his hometown. He was arrested, convicted of arson, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Prison changed Hansen, but not in the way rehabilitation programs intended. Instead of reforming him, the experience hardened his resentment and taught him valuable lessons about evading detection. He studied the mistakes that had led to his capture and vowed never to be so careless again. When he was released after serving just 18 months, Hansen had already begun formulating the methods he would later use to avoid capture for much longer crimes. Upon his release, Hansen married a local woman and attempted to build a conventional life. He learned the bakery trade from his father and seemed to be settling into small-town respectability. However, his criminal impulses had not been cured by his time behind bars. In 1960, he was arrested again, this time for burning down a bus barn. The pattern was becoming clear. Hansen was an arsonist with a particular fascination for destroying vehicles and buildings. Seeking a fresh start away from his troubled past, Hansen and his wife moved to Alaska in 1967. The last frontier, with its vast wilderness and sparse population, seemed like the perfect place for a man seeking to reinvent himself. Hansen opened a successful bakery in Anchorage and quickly became known as a skilled businessman and accomplished hunter. To his neighbors and customers, he appeared to be the embodiment of the rugged Alaskan spirit, hardworking, self-reliant, and devoted to the outdoor lifestyle that defined the state. Alaska in the 1970s was experiencing rapid growth due to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The influx of workers, many of them single men with substantial paychecks, created a thriving nightlife scene in Anchorage. Strip clubs, massage parlors, and prostitution flourished in certain parts of the city, creating what many called a modern-day Wild West atmosphere. It was in this environment that Hansen began to frequent establishments that catered to men seeking the company of women. For Hansen, these venues represented something more than simple entertainment. Here were women who, in his mind, embodied everything he had been rejected by in his youth. Dancers and prostitutes became symbols of the feminine rejection he had experienced, and he began to develop elaborate fantasies about dominating and controlling them. What started as occasional visits to strip clubs gradually evolved into a more systematic pattern of behavior. Hanson's method was initially simple but effective. He would approach women working in Anchorage's red light district, often targeting those who appeared vulnerable or desperate. Using his respectable appearance and apparent wealth, he would convince them to accompany him to his home or other locations. Once he had them isolated, his true nature would emerge. The first known victim was a young dancer who disappeared in 1973. She had last been seen getting into a car with a middle-aged man who matched Hanson's description, but without a body or concrete evidence, police treated it as just another case of a transient woman leaving town unexpectedly. This pattern would repeat itself many times over the next decade, as women disappeared from Anchorage's underworld without generating significant law enforcement attention. Hanson's crimes evolved over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated and brutal. He developed a signature method that combined his hunting skills with his desire to dominate his victims. After abducting women, he would take them to his cabin in the Alaskan wilderness, where he had constructed what amounted to a private prison. There, he would hold them captive for days or even weeks, subjecting them to repeated sexual assaults and psychological torture. The most horrifying aspect of Hanson's crimes was what he called the hunt. After keeping victims captive for extended periods, he would release them into the wilderness armed only with minimal clothing and perhaps a small head start. Then, using his expert hunting skills and a high-powered rifle or bow and arrow, he would track them down like animals. For Hanson, this represented the ultimate expression of power and control, turning human beings into prey in a deadly game where only he knew the rules. The remote Alaskan wilderness provided the perfect hunting ground for Hanson's twisted games. The vast expanses of forest, mountains, and tundra meant that bodies might never be found, and even if they were discovered, the harsh environment would likely destroy most forensic evidence. Hanson had studied the terrain around Anchorage extensively, identifying numerous locations where he could conduct his hunts without fear of interruption. Between 1973 and 1983, Hanson is believed to have murdered at least 17 women, though the actual number may be much higher. His victims were primarily young women involved in Anchorage's sex trade, individuals whose disappearances were often not immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. Many were runaways or women estranged from their families, making them perfect targets for a predator who understood the importance of selecting victims who wouldn't be missed. Hanson's double life was remarkably well maintained throughout this period. By day, he was Robert Hanson, the successful baker, a man who employed several people and was known for his charitable contributions to local organizations. He was married with children, owned a nice home in a respectable neighborhood, and was regarded as a pillar of the Anchorage business community. His bakery produced some of the finest pastries and breads in the city, and customers often commented on his friendly demeanor and professional service. By night and on weekends, Hanson transformed into something entirely different. He would cruise the streets of Anchorage in his car or small airplane, searching for potential victims. His flying skills, developed during his years in Alaska, gave him access to remote areas that would have been impossible to reach by vehicle. He could transport victims to isolated locations, conduct his hunts, and return to civilization without leaving a trace. The investigation that would eventually bring Hanson to justice began not with a missing person report or a discovered body, but with a survivor. On June 13, 1983, a 17-year-old prostitute named Cindy Paulson managed to escape from Hanson's clutches and made it to safety. She immediately contacted police and provided a detailed account of her ordeal, including descriptions of Hanson's home, his methods, and his plans for her. Paulson's story was initially met with skepticism by some investigators. She was a young prostitute with a history of drug use, making her testimony potentially unreliable in court. However, Detective Glenn Floto of the Anchorage Police Department recognized the significance of her account and began investigating Hanson seriously. Floty was an experienced investigator who understood that sometimes the most important breaks in cases come from unexpected sources. The investigation revealed that Hanson was indeed involved in activities that went far beyond his respectable public persona. Surveillance teams observed him frequenting areas known for prostitution, and records showed that he had made numerous flights to remote areas of Alaska in his private plane. When investigators obtained search warrants for Hansen's home and property, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence that would ultimately seal his fate. Inside Hansen's home, police found detailed maps of Alaska with numerous locations marked in Hansen's handwriting. Many of these marks corresponded to sites where bodies had been discovered or where missing women had last been seen. They also found extensive collections of weapons, including the rifles and archery equipment that Hansen had used in his crimes. Perhaps most damning, they discovered jewelry and personal items that belonged to several of his victims. Hansen's airplane logs provided additional evidence of his guilt. The records showed flights to remote areas that coincided with the disappearances of several women. When investigators compared these flight patterns with the locations where bodies had been found, the correlations were unmistakable. Hansen had been using his plane as a tool in his crimes, allowing him to transport victims to areas where rescue would be impossible and discovery unlikely. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, but prosecutors knew that building a case against Hansen would be challenging. Many of the victims were women whose lifestyles made them unsympathetic to potential jurors. And Hansen's reputation in the community was so strong that many people simply couldn't believe he was capable of such crimes. The prosecution would need to present a compelling narrative that explained how a respected businessman could lead such a horrific double life. When confronted with the evidence against him, Hansen initially denied any involvement in the crimes. However, as the investigation progressed and more evidence accumulated, his position became increasingly untenable. His attorneys eventually advised him to negotiate a plea agreement that would allow him to avoid the death penalty in exchange for providing information about his crimes and the locations of his victims' remains. In February 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 461 years for other charges. As part of his plea agreement, he led investigators to several remote locations where he had buried his victims, providing closure for families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The Hansen case had profound implications for law enforcement in Alaska and across the United States. It highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes involving transient populations and demonstrated the importance of taking seriously reports from victims who might not be considered credible witnesses. The case also showed how sophisticated criminals could use Alaska's unique geography to their advantage, requiring new investigative techniques and interagency cooperation. For the city of Anchorage, Hansen's arrest and conviction were deeply shocking. Many residents had known him personally, had bought bread and pastries from his bakery, and had considered him a valued member of the community. The revelation that this seemingly ordinary man had been responsible for such extraordinary evil forced many people to reconsider their assumptions about the nature of criminal behavior. The psychological profile that emerged from Hansen's case became a subject of intense study among criminal psychologists and FBI profilers. He represented a particular type of serial killer, highly organized, capable of maintaining a normal facade for extended periods, and able to satisfy his violent impulses through carefully planned crimes that minimized his risk of detection. His use of hunting metaphors and techniques in his crimes also provided insights into how some killers rationalize their actions. Hansen's victims were not forgotten in the aftermath of his conviction. Advocates for sex workers and missing persons used the case to highlight the vulnerabilities faced by women in high-risk occupations and the need for better protection and support services. The case also led to improvements in how missing person cases are investigated, particularly when the victims are involved in activities that put them at risk. Robert Hansen died in prison on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75. He had served 30 years of his sentence and had never shown genuine remorse for his crimes. During his time in prison, he occasionally provided additional information about his crimes to investigators, but he never fully revealed the extent of his activities. Many law enforcement officials believe that the true number of his victims will never be known. The legacy of the Butcher Baker case extends beyond the immediate horror of the crimes themselves. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades, and that communities must remain vigilant against those who would prey upon the vulnerable. The case also demonstrates the dedication of law enforcement professionals who refuse to give up on cases involving victims that society might prefer to forget. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, where Hansen conducted his deadly hunts, nature has begun to reclaim the sites where his crimes occurred. Trees grow taller, snow covers the ground, and wildlife returns to areas that once witnessed unspeakable horrors. But the memory of what happened there remains, serving as a testament to both the capacity for evil that exists in some individuals and the determination of those who work to bring justice to the victims. The story of Robert Hansen reminds us that monsters are not always obvious. They don't always look like the villains in movies or novels. Sometimes they look like ordinary businessmen, neighbors, and community members. They smile, they contribute to charity, they maintain successful enterprises, and they hide their true nature behind carefully constructed masks of respectability. For the families of Hansen's victims, justice came too late to save their loved ones, but it provided some measure of closure and the knowledge that the man responsible for their pain would never hurt anyone else. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of criminal violence and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of truth and justice. The butcher baker of Alaska hunted his last victim decades ago, but his story continues to resonate as a chilling example of how predators can hide in plain sight, using respectability as camouflage while they pursue their deadly obsessions in the shadows. Story 2. The Genesee River Killer. In the late 1980s, the city of Rochester, New York, was gripped by terror as a series of brutal murders began claiming the lives of local women. The killer seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of the area around the Genesee River, using its isolated banks and industrial bridges as dumping grounds for his victims. What authorities didn't initially realize was that they were dealing with a predator who had already killed before, a man whose capacity for violence had been forged in the crucible of war and nurtured by decades of psychological dysfunction. Arthur John Shawcross would become known as the Genesee River Killer, but his path to infamy began long before he terrorized the streets of Rochester. His story is one of systematic failures of the justice system, the mental health system, and society itself to recognize and contain a dangerous predator before he could claim more lives. Arthur Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, to Arthur Roy Shawcross and Elizabeth Urax Shawcross. From the very beginning, his life was marked by instability and dysfunction. His father was a harsh disciplinarian with a violent temper, while his mother was emotionally distant and often absent. The family moved frequently during Arthur's childhood, never allowing him to form stable relationships or develop a sense of belonging anywhere. As a child, Arthur exhibited troubling behaviors that should have served as warning signs. He was cruel to animals, often torturing and killing neighborhood pets with disturbing, methodical precision. He set fires and destroyed property, showing no remorse for his actions. Most concerning was his early fascination with death and violence, which manifested in his drawings and play activities. Arthur's academic performance was poor, and he struggled with learning disabilities that were never properly diagnosed or treated. He was frequently truant from school, preferring to spend his time alone in the woods, where he could indulge his growing obsession with hunting and killing animals. Teachers noted his aggressive behavior toward other children and his complete inability to form normal social connections. The Shawcross family's frequent moves meant that Arthur never received consistent intervention for his behavioral problems. Each new school and community saw only a snapshot of his disturbed behavior before the family moved on, leaving no continuous record of his escalating problems. This pattern of avoidance and neglect would prove catastrophic in the years to come. By his teenage years, Arthur had developed into a young man of average height and build, with dark hair and penetrating eyes that many would later describe as unsettling. He possessed a superficial charm that could mask his true nature when necessary, but those who knew him well recognized the underlying violence that simmered just beneath the surface. In 1967, at the age of 22, Arthur Shawcross enlisted in the United States Army. The Vietnam War was at its height, and young men across America were being drafted or volunteering to serve their country. For Arthur, military service represented both an escape from his troubled past and an opportunity to channel his violent tendencies in a socially acceptable way. Arthur was assigned to the 4th Supply and Transport Company, where he served as a supply clerk. Contrary to later claims he would make about his military service, Arthur never saw direct combat as an infantry soldier. However, he was stationed in Vietnam during some of the war's most intense periods, and he witnessed the brutality and chaos that characterized the conflict. It was during his time in Vietnam that Arthur claimed to have committed his first murders. According to his own accounts, which varied significantly over the years, he killed two Vietnamese women and engaged in acts of cannibalism. While these claims were never verified and may have been fabricated, they became part of the mythology that Arthur constructed around himself, a mythology that portrayed him as a combat veteran traumatized by his experiences in war. What is certain is that Arthur's time in Vietnam provided him with exposure to violence and death that would influence his later crimes. He learned military tactics and survival skills that he would later use to evade capture. More importantly, he learned to compartmentalize violence and to justify brutal acts as necessary or even heroic. Arthur received an honorable discharge from the Army in 1968, but his readjustment to civilian life was difficult. He struggled to find steady employment and had difficulty maintaining relationships. He began drinking heavily and exhibited signs of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were poorly understood and rarely treated at the time. Arthur Shawcross's transition from disturbed individual to active killer began in the early 1970s. In 1972, he committed his first confirmed murders, the brutal killings of two children in the Watertown, New York area. These crimes would establish a pattern of violence that would define the rest of his life. The first victim was 10-year-old Jack Blake, a local boy who disappeared while riding his bicycle near his home. Arthur lured the child to a wooded area under the pretense of showing him something interesting, then sexually assaulted and murdered him. The boy's body was found several days later, bearing evidence of the horrific abuse he had endured before his death. Just 4 months later, Arthur struck again. This time, his victim was 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill, who vanished while walking to a neighborhood store. Arthur had been watching the girl for weeks, learning her routines and identifying opportunities to approach her. When he finally made his move, he abducted Karen and took her to a remote location where he subjected her to sexual assault and torture before killing her. The murders of Jack Blake and Karen Ann Hill sent shockwaves through the small community of Watertown. Parents kept their children indoors, and the local police launched an intensive investigation. However, Arthur's careful planning and knowledge of the local terrain allowed him to avoid immediate detection. The breakthrough in the case came when witnesses reported seeing Arthur with both children shortly before their disappearances. His previous arrest for minor offenses meant that his fingerprints were on file, and physical evidence found at the crime scenes eventually linked him to both murders. Arthur's arrest in October 1972 marked the end of a brief but terrifying killing spree. However, the justice system's handling of his case would prove to be tragically inadequate, setting the stage for future murders that could have been prevented. When Arthur Shawcross was arrested for the murders of Jack Blake and Karen Ann Hill, prosecutors faced a challenging case. While they had strong evidence linking him to both crimes, the legal system of the early 1970s was not well equipped to handle cases involving child murder and sexual assault. Capital punishment had been effectively suspended in New York State, and prosecutors were concerned about their ability to secure convictions on the most serious charges. In a decision that would later be widely criticized, prosecutors offered Arthur a plea bargain. In exchange for pleading guilty to manslaughter in the death of Karen Ann Hill, charges related to Jack Blake's murder would be dropped. The deal also included a sentence of 25 years in prison, which seemed substantial at the time, but would prove to be tragically inadequate. Arthur accepted the plea bargain, admitting his guilt in Karen Ann Hill's death while maintaining his innocence in the murder of Jack Blake. The families of both victims were devastated by the decision, feeling that justice had not been served and that Arthur had escaped full accountability for his crimes. During his sentencing hearing, Arthur showed no remorse for his actions. He spoke in clinical terms about the murders, displaying a chilling lack of empathy for his victims or their families. Mental health professionals who examined him noted his antisocial personality traits and his potential for future violence, but their warnings were not given sufficient weight in determining his sentence. Arthur began serving his sentence at Attica Correctional Facility, one of New York State's maximum security prisons. Initially, he was placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and the threat posed by other inmates who viewed child killers as the lowest form of criminal. During his incarceration, Arthur Shawcross became the subject of extensive psychological evaluation and study. Mental health professionals were fascinated by his case, as he represented a relatively rare type of criminal, a child killer who showed clear signs of escalating violence and sexual deviance. Dr. Richard Krause, the prison's chief psychiatrist, conducted numerous interviews with Arthur over the years. These sessions revealed a complex individual who seemed to compartmentalize his violent impulses while maintaining a facade of normalcy in other areas of his life. Arthur was capable of discussing his crimes in detail without showing any emotional response, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else. Arthur's psychological profile revealed several concerning traits. He demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for his victims, viewing them as objects rather than human beings. He showed no genuine remorse for his actions, though he was capable of mimicking appropriate emotional responses when it served his purposes. Most troubling was his continued sexual fantasies involving children, which he discussed openly with prison psychiatrists. Despite these concerning findings, Arthur was considered a model prisoner during much of his incarceration. He participated in educational programs, maintained steady employment in the prison workshops, and avoided major disciplinary incidents. This good behavior, combined with prison overcrowding and changing attitudes toward rehabilitation, would eventually work in his favor when he became eligible for parole. Arthur also used his time in prison to craft a new narrative about his crimes and his life. He began claiming that his actions were the result of trauma he had suffered in Vietnam, despite the fact that his violent tendencies had been evident long before his military service. This narrative of the damaged war veteran would become central to his later attempts to gain sympathy and avoid responsibility for his actions. In 1987, after serving just 15 years of his 25-year sentence, Arthur Shawcross was granted parole. The decision was controversial from the moment it was announced, with victims' families, law enforcement officials, and community leaders expressing outrage at the prospect of his release. The parole board's decision was based on several factors, including Arthur's good behavior in prison, his participation in rehabilitation programs, and the overcrowding crisis facing New York State's correctional system. Prison officials argued that Arthur had been a model prisoner who had shown signs of rehabilitation and posed minimal risk to public safety. However, critics of the decision pointed to Arthur's complete lack of remorse for his crimes and the warnings from mental health professionals about his potential for future violence. They argued that someone who had committed such heinous acts against children should never be released, regardless of their behavior in prison. The controversy intensified when it became clear that no community wanted Arthur Shawcross living among them. Town after town rejected proposed placements, citing public safety concerns and community opposition. This not-in-my-backyard response highlighted the fundamental problem with releasing dangerous offenders. While the parole board could order his release, no one wanted to accept responsibility for housing him. Eventually, Arthur was placed in a halfway house in Rochester, New York, a city large enough to absorb him without the intense scrutiny he would have faced in a smaller community. The decision to place him in Rochester would prove to be a fatal mistake that would cost multiple women their lives. Arthur Shawcross arrived in Rochester in April 1987, carrying with him a new identity and a carefully constructed cover story. Parole officials had advised him to use his middle name, John, and to present himself as a Vietnam veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. This persona would help explain any odd behavior while generating sympathy from potential employers and acquaintances. Rochester in the late 1980s was a city in transition. Once a thriving industrial center built around companies like Kodak and Xerox, it was struggling with economic decline and urban decay. The downtown area had become home to a transient population that included prostitutes, drug addicts, and others living on society's margins, exactly the type of vulnerable individuals that Arthur would eventually target. Arthur initially lived in a halfway house near downtown Rochester, where he was required to follow strict rules and report regularly to his parole officer. He found employment at a local salvage yard, where his military background and willingness to work hard made him a valued employee. To his co-workers, he seemed like a quiet, reliable man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. However, Arthur was already beginning to scout for potential victims. He would drive around the city at night, familiarizing himself with the areas where prostitutes worked and vulnerable women might be found alone. He paid particular attention to the bridges and industrial areas along the Genesee River, noting their isolation and suitability for disposing of bodies. Arthur also began cultivating relationships with several women, using his charm and fabricated war stories to gain their trust and affection. These relationships served multiple purposes. They provided him with alibis, helped establish his cover identity, and gave him access to the marginal communities where he would eventually find his victims. On March 24, 1988, less than a year after his release from prison, Arthur Shawcross committed his first murder in Rochester. The victim was Dorothy Blackburn, a 27-year-old woman who worked as a prostitute in the city's downtown area. Dorothy, known to her friends as Dotsy, had struggled with drug addiction and poverty, circumstances that had led her to sex work as a means of survival. Arthur encountered Dorothy on Lake Avenue, one of Rochester's main thoroughfares and a known area for prostitution. He approached her as a potential customer, and she agreed to accompany him to a secluded location for a sexual encounter. Arthur drove her to a remote area near the Genesee River, where the industrial landscape provided privacy for his planned attack. What happened next followed a pattern that Arthur would repeat with subsequent victims. After engaging in sexual activity, Arthur's demeanor changed dramatically. He became aggressive and violent, overpowering Dorothy and strangling her to death. The murder was not spontaneous. Arthur had brought ligatures and other implements that suggested premeditation. After killing Dorothy, Arthur disposed of her body in a way that demonstrated his careful planning and knowledge of the local area. He placed her remains near the Genesee River, in a location that was isolated enough to delay discovery, but accessible enough for him to return if necessary. This location would become part of Arthur's pattern, as he would use the river and its surrounding areas as his personal dumping ground. Dorothy Blackburn's disappearance was initially treated as a missing person case rather than a homicide. Her lifestyle and history of drug addiction led some investigators to assume that she had simply left town or met with an accident. This assumption would prove costly, as it delayed the recognition that a serial killer was operating in Rochester. Following Dorothy Blackburn's murder, Arthur Shawcross entered a period of intense killing that would terrorize Rochester for more than 2 years. Between 1988 and 1990, he would murder at least 10 more women, all of whom shared certain characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable to his predations. Arthur's victims were primarily women involved in prostitution, though some were simply women who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. They ranged in age from their late teens to their 50s, and most struggled with addiction, poverty, or other circumstances that placed them at risk. Arthur specifically targeted these women because he understood that their disappearances might not be immediately investigated with the same urgency as those of more conventional victims. The second victim was Anna Marie Steffen, a 28-year-old woman who disappeared in July 1988. Like Dorothy Blackburn, Anna worked as a prostitute and was known to frequent the same areas of downtown Rochester. Arthur followed his established pattern, approaching Anna as a customer before driving her to an isolated location where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Anna's body was found several weeks later in a wooded area near the Genesee River. The condition of her remains made it difficult for investigators to determine the exact cause of death, but the location and circumstances suggested that she had been murdered. However, police still had not recognized that they were dealing with a serial killer. The murders continued with increasing frequency as Arthur became more confident and refined his methods. In September 1988, he killed Dorothy Keeler, a 59-year-old woman who was not involved in prostitution, but who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from Arthur when her car broke down. Her murder demonstrated that Arthur was not exclusively targeting sex workers, but was opportunistic in his choice of victims. By early 1989, Rochester police investigators began to recognize patterns in the disappearances and murders of local women. The victims shared similar demographics and circumstances, and several had last been seen in the same general areas of the city. Most significantly, many of the bodies were being discovered in locations along or near the Genesee River. Detective Lynn Johnston of the Rochester Police Department's Major Crimes Unit was assigned to coordinate the investigation. A veteran investigator with extensive experience in homicide cases, Johnston quickly recognized that the murders were likely the work of a single perpetrator. The killer's methods showed consistency and evolution, suggesting someone who was learning from each crime and becoming more sophisticated in his approach. The investigation faced significant challenges from the beginning. The victims' lifestyles meant that they often went missing for days or weeks before anyone reported their disappearances. This delay made it difficult to establish timelines and identify potential witnesses. Additionally, the killer's choice of disposal sites along the river meant that bodies were often discovered in an advanced state of decomposition, making forensic analysis more difficult. Detective Johnston and her team began developing a profile of the suspected killer. They determined that he was likely a local man with intimate knowledge of the Rochester area, particularly the industrial zones along the Genesee River. His ability to approach sex workers without arousing suspicion suggested that he appeared non-threatening and possibly had previous experience with prostitutes. The investigation also revealed that the killer was mobile, with access to a vehicle that allowed him to transport victims to remote locations and dispose of their bodies. The geographic spread of the dump sites suggested someone who was familiar with multiple areas of the county and comfortable driving in isolated industrial zones. As news of the murder spread throughout Rochester and the surrounding region, the case began attracting significant media attention. Local newspapers and television stations provided regular coverage of the investigation, often focusing on the vulnerabilities of the victims and the apparent randomness of their deaths. The media coverage had both positive and negative effects on the investigation. On one hand, it raised public awareness and generated tips from citizens who might have witnessed suspicious activity. The attention also put pressure on law enforcement to dedicate additional resources to solving the cases. However, the media coverage also sensationalized the crimes and often portrayed the victims in unflattering ways. The focus on their involvement in prostitution and drug use sometimes overshadowed their humanity and the tragedy of their deaths. This coverage reflected broader societal attitudes towards sex workers and marginalized women, attitudes that may have contributed to the delay in recognizing the serial nature of the crimes. The public response to the murders was complex. While there was genuine concern for the safety of all women in the Rochester area, there was also a sense among some residents that the victims had put themselves at risk through their lifestyle choices. This attitude made it more difficult to generate the kind of community support and cooperation that investigators needed to solve the cases. As the investigation progressed, Rochester police worked with FBI profilers to develop a more detailed psychological profile of the killer. The profile that emerged painted a picture of a man who was likely in his 30s or 40s with a history of violence against women and possibly a military or law enforcement background. The profilers noted several key characteristics of the crimes that provided insight into the killer's psychology. The post-mortem positioning of some victims suggested that the killer spent time with the bodies after death, possibly engaging in sexual activity or other ritualistic behavior. This indicated a high level of sexual deviance and a need for control over his victims. The killer's choice of victims also provided important clues about his psychology. His focus on sex workers and other marginalized women suggested someone who viewed these individuals as disposable or deserving of violence. This dehumanization of victims was consistent with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic traits. The geographic pattern of the crimes indicated that the killer was comfortable operating in industrial and isolated areas, suggesting possible employment in construction, transportation, or other fields that would familiarize him with such locations. The consistency of his dump sites along the Genesee River suggested an emotional or practical connection to that particular area. The breakthrough in the Genesee River killer case came through an innovative investigative technique that had rarely been used in serial killer investigations at that time. In January 1990, Rochester police began using helicopter surveillance to monitor the areas along the Genesee River where bodies had been discovered. The helicopter surveillance program was based on the theory that the killer might return to his dump sites, either to check on the bodies or to relive the crimes. This behavior, known as revisiting, was common among serial killers and had been documented in numerous cases. Investigators hoped that by maintaining aerial surveillance of the river areas, they might catch the killer in the act of returning to a crime scene. The surveillance operation required significant resources and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. The helicopter flights were conducted at various times of day and night, with observers using binoculars and cameras to monitor activity below. The operation had to be conducted discreetly to avoid alerting the killer to the surveillance. For weeks, the helicopter surveillance yielded no significant results. Observers documented various individuals visiting the river areas, but none exhibited the behavior patterns that investigators were looking for. The operation was expensive and time-consuming, and there was growing pressure to abandon it in favor of more traditional investigative methods. On January 3, 1990, the helicopter surveillance program finally produced the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for. During a routine flight over the Genesee River area, observers spotted a man standing on the Veterans Memorial Bridge, apparently urinating into the river below. While this behavior was not inherently suspicious, the man's location was significant. The bridge was directly above an area where one of the victims had been found. The helicopter crew continued to observe the man, noting his physical appearance and the license plate number of his vehicle. The man appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair and a medium build. He was driving a light-colored car that he had parked near the bridge approach. After several minutes, the man returned to his vehicle and drove away. The license plate number was immediately run through police databases, revealing that the vehicle was registered to Arthur John Shawcross of Rochester. When investigators pulled Arthur's file, they were shocked to discover that he was a convicted child killer who had been released on parole just 3 years earlier. The discovery of Arthur's identity transformed the investigation overnight. Suddenly, investigators had a suspect with a documented history of violence and murder, someone whose background and circumstances fit perfectly with the profile they had developed. The challenge now was to gather enough evidence to link Arthur to the Genesee River murders. With Arthur Shawcross identified as the prime suspect, Rochester police launched an intensive investigation to gather evidence linking him to the murders. This process required careful coordination to avoid alerting Arthur to their suspicions while building a strong enough case to ensure successful prosecution. Investigators began by conducting surveillance of Arthur's daily activities. They documented his movements, his associates, and his behavior patterns. They discovered that Arthur frequently drove through the areas where victims had been found and that he was known to frequent locations where prostitutes worked. The investigation also involved re-examining all of the physical evidence from the crime scenes with Arthur as a potential suspect. Forensic specialists looked for any traces of DNA, fingerprints, or other evidence that might link him to the victims or crime scenes. They also began comparing his known possessions and vehicle characteristics to evidence found at the scenes. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from Arthur's employment records. Investigators discovered that Arthur had been absent from work on several dates that corresponded to the disappearances of victims. While this was circumstantial evidence, it helped establish that Arthur had the opportunity to commit the crimes. Investigators also interviewed people who knew Arthur, including co-workers, acquaintances, and the women he had been romantically involved with since his release from prison. These interviews revealed a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior and concerning statements about women and violence. On January 5, 1990, just 2 days after the helicopter observation, Arthur Shawcross was arrested on charges related to the Genesee River murders. The arrest took place at his workplace, where investigators had been conducting surveillance to ensure that Arthur would not have an opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Arthur's reaction to his arrest was notably calm and resigned. He did not resist or protest his innocence, instead asking matter-of-factly about the charges against him. This reaction was consistent with his behavior during his previous arrest for child murder, suggesting that he had been expecting this moment or had resigned himself to its inevitability. The arrest was conducted carefully to preserve Arthur's constitutional rights and ensure that any subsequent confession or evidence would be admissible in court. Arthur was read his Miranda rights and transported to the Monroe County Jail, where he would await formal charges and trial. News of the arrest spread quickly throughout Rochester and the surrounding region. The revelation that the suspected Genesee River killer was a previously convicted child murderer who had been released on parole generated intense public outrage and calls for reform of the parole system. Within hours of his arrest, Arthur Shawcross began providing investigators with detailed confessions to the Genesee River murders. His willingness to confess surprised many observers, given his previous experience with the criminal justice system and his understanding of the potential consequences. Arthur's confessions were remarkably detailed and consistent with the known facts of the crimes. He provided information about the victims, the locations where he had encountered them, and the methods he had used to kill them. He also led investigators to the remains of victims whose bodies had not yet been discovered. The confessions revealed the full scope of Arthur's crimes and provided insight into his motivations and methods. He described approaching his victims as potential customers for sex, then driving them to isolated locations where he would assault and murder them. He showed no remorse for his actions, instead describing them in clinical terms as if they were routine activities. Arthur's confessions also included disturbing details about his behavior after the murders. He admitted to returning to crime scenes to engage in sexual activity with the decomposing bodies of his victims. He also described fantasies about the murders and his plans for future crimes that had been interrupted by his arrest. Arthur Shawcross's trial began in October 1990, attracting intense media attention and public interest. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Howard Reelan, presented a comprehensive case based on Arthur's confessions, physical evidence, and his documented history of violence. The defense strategy focused on arguing that Arthur was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that his actions were the result of severe mental illness and trauma from his experiences in Vietnam. Defense attorneys brought in psychiatrists and psychologists to testify about Arthur's mental state and his capacity to understand the nature of his actions. However, the prosecution successfully countered the insanity defense by demonstrating that Arthur's crimes were carefully planned and executed. They showed that he had taken steps to avoid detection, had disposed of evidence, and had continued his normal daily activities between murders. This behavior indicated that Arthur understood the wrongfulness of his actions and was capable of controlling his behavior. The trial featured testimony from numerous witnesses, including law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and people who had known Arthur since his release from prison. The evidence presented painted a picture of a calculating predator who had used his freedom to hunt and kill vulnerable women. On December 13, 1990, after deliberating for just 7 hours, the jury found Arthur Shawcross guilty of murder in the second degree for 10 of the 11 victims. The 11th charge resulted in a conviction for manslaughter. Arthur was sentenced to 250 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again be released to threaten public safety. The case of Arthur Shawcross had profound and lasting impacts on the criminal justice system, particularly regarding parole decisions and the monitoring of released sex offenders. The revelation that a convicted child killer had been able to commit multiple murders while on parole led to significant reforms in New York State's parole system. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized women, particularly those involved in sex work, to predatory violence. The delayed recognition of the serial nature of the crimes reflected broader societal attitudes that devalued the lives of sex workers and other marginalized individuals. Arthur Shawcross died in prison on November 10, 2008, at the age of 63, bringing his story to a final close. However, his crimes continue to serve as a case study for law enforcement professionals, criminologists, and mental health experts studying the psychology and behavior patterns of serial killers. The Genesee River Killer case remains one of the most significant serial murder investigations in New York State history, serving as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of releasing violent offenders and a testament to the persistence and dedication of the investigators who brought Arthur Shawcross to justice. Story 3: The Tacoma Axe Killer. In the misty, rain-soaked streets of Tacoma, Washington, during the winter of 1911, a shadow fell across the Pacific Northwest that would forever change how residents viewed their quiet neighborhoods. The city, nestled between Puget Sound and Mount Rainier, had always prided itself on being a safe haven for working families, loggers, and dock workers. But as February gave way to March, an unspeakable terror began to unfold in the modest homes of hardworking immigrants, leaving investigators baffled and an entire community paralyzed with fear. The story begins on a cold February night in 1911, when the Cowell family, Felix, his wife, and their young daughter, were discovered in their small frame house on South Yakima Avenue. What police found inside would haunt even the most seasoned investigators for decades to come. The family had been brutally murdered with an axe, their bodies arranged in a way that suggested both rage and disturbing calculation. The weapon, a common woodsman's axe, had been left at the scene, wiped clean but bearing the weight of unspeakable violence. Felix Cowell was a recent immigrant from Austria-Hungary, part of the wave of European settlers who had come to the Pacific Northwest seeking opportunity in the booming lumber industry. He worked long hours at the docks, loading timber onto ships bound for California and beyond. His wife tended to their small garden and took in laundry to make ends meet. Their daughter, barely 10 years old, had been looking forward to spring when she could play outside without the constant drizzle that defined Tacoma winters. None of them could have imagined that their American dream would end in such horrific fashion. The crime scene told a story of methodical brutality. The killer had entered through the back door, which showed signs of having been forced open with a tool, possibly the same axe used in the murders. Each family member had been struck multiple times, with a precision that suggested the perpetrator was familiar with such tools. More disturbing still was the discovery that nothing had been stolen. Money left on the kitchen table remained untouched, as did Felix's pocket watch and his wife's modest jewelry. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. Detective James Murphy, a veteran of the Tacoma Police Department who had seen his share of violence in the rough-and-tumble port city, later wrote in his personal notes that the Cowell murders were unlike anything he had encountered. The killer had taken time to arrange the bodies, covering the faces of the victims with cloth from their own home. It was a detail that suggested either remorse or a twisted sense of ritual that chilled investigators to their core. Word of the murders spread quickly through Tacoma's tight-knit immigrant communities. Italian families who lived in the same neighborhood as the Cowells began locking their doors and windows, many sleeping with axes and knives beside their beds. The city's small but growing population of Eastern European immigrants whispered about old-world superstitions and ancient curses. Fear began to transform the social fabric of the community, with neighbors viewing each other with suspicious eyes. But the killer wasn't finished. Just 3 weeks after the Cowell murders, another family fell victim to the same methodical violence. The Rossi family, Giuseppe, his wife Maria, and their 3 young children were discovered in their home on Portland Avenue, less than 2 miles from the first crime scene. The pattern was identical: forced entry through the back door, multiple axe wounds, and the eerie arrangement of bodies with faces covered. Once again, nothing had been stolen, and the murder weapon had been left behind, meticulously cleaned. Giuseppe Rossi had been a popular figure in the Italian community, known for his skill as a stonemason and his generous spirit. He often helped newer immigrants find work and housing, translating for those who struggle with English. Maria was beloved for her cooking, often providing meals for families who had fallen on hard times. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, aged 6 to 12, were bright students who dreamed of becoming teachers and doctors. The Rossi murders sent shockwaves through not just the Italian community, but the entire city of Tacoma. Detective Murphy found himself leading an investigation unlike any in the city's history. The similarities between the crimes were impossible to ignore, yet the killer had left behind frustratingly few clues. Fingerprinting was still a relatively new science in 1911, and the meticulous cleaning of the murder weapons eliminated what might have been crucial evidence. The detective began to study the crime scenes with an almost obsessive attention to detail, looking for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity or motivation. What emerged from Murphy's investigation was a profile of a killer who was both organized and deeply disturbed. The forced entries suggested someone with knowledge of simple tools and basic carpentry, skills common among the working men of Tacoma. The precision of the attacks indicated familiarity with axes, pointing to someone who worked in logging, construction, or a related trade. Most unsettling was the ritual aspect of covering the victims' faces, which suggested either a twisted form of respect for the dead or an inability to face the consequences of the violence. The third attack came in early April, targeting the Petrov family on Southern Street. Dmitry Petrov was a Bulgarian immigrant who worked at the sawmill. His wife, Anya, took in sewing, and their teenage son helped deliver groceries after school. The crime followed the same horrific pattern, but this time there was a survivor. The family's youngest daughter, 8-year-old Elena, had hidden under her bed when she heard the commotion. She remained there, trembling in silence, as the killer methodically murdered her family. Elena's testimony provided the first real breakthrough in the case. She described hearing heavy footsteps, the sound of splintering wood, and her father's voice raised in alarm before the violence began. Most importantly, she had caught a glimpse of the killer through a crack in her bedroom door. She described a tall man wearing dark clothing and a cap pulled low over his face. He moved with purpose, she said, as if he knew exactly what he intended to do. The psychological impact of Elena's survival cannot be overstated. Here was a child who had witnessed the systematic destruction of her family, yet had the presence of mind to remain hidden until neighbors discovered the crime scene the following morning. Her testimony, while limited by trauma and the darkness of that terrible night, provided investigators with their first concrete description of the perpetrator. Detective Murphy intensified his investigation, focusing on men who fit Elena's description and had the skills necessary to commit such crimes. The axe murders had created a pattern of terror that seemed to target immigrant families specifically, leading some to theorize that the killer harbored anti-immigrant sentiments common in some circles of early 20th century America. The victims were all hard-working families who had come to America seeking better lives, only to fall prey to an inexplicable evil that lurked in their adopted home. As spring turned to summer, the investigation expanded beyond Tacoma's city limits. Reports began to surface of similar crimes in other Pacific Northwest communities. A family in Spokane had been murdered with an axe in circumstances that bore striking similarities to the Tacoma killings. Another case in Portland, Oregon, shared the same methodical brutality and ritual elements. It became clear that the Tacoma axe killer might be responsible for a wider campaign of terror that stretched across the region. The breakthrough came in late July 1911, when a railroad worker reported seeing a man matching Elena's description boarding freight trains that traveled between the cities where murders had occurred. This led investigators to focus on transient workers who moved along the rail lines, following seasonal work opportunities in logging, mining, and construction. It was a population that could easily disappear into the anonymity of America's growing industrial landscape. Detective Murphy's investigation eventually led to a man named Johann Schmidt, a German immigrant who worked various jobs along the railroad lines. Schmidt had been in Tacoma during each of the murders, and his background included extensive experience with woodworking tools. More damning still were items found in his possession that had belonged to victims, though he claimed to have found them discarded near railroad tracks. The case against Schmidt was largely circumstantial, built on his presence in each murder location and the possession of victims' belongings. In an era before modern forensic science, investigators relied heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Schmidt maintained his innocence throughout the legal proceedings, claiming that he was being persecuted because of his immigrant status and transient lifestyle. The trial of Johann Schmidt captivated not just Tacoma, but newspapers across the Pacific Northwest. The courtroom was packed daily with survivors from the immigrant communities that had been terrorized, many of whom had never before participated in American legal proceedings. The prosecution painted Schmidt as a calculating killer who preyed on vulnerable families, while the defense argued that he was a convenient scapegoat for crimes that remained unsolved. Elena Petrov, now 9 years old, was called to testify, a controversial decision even by the standards of 1911. Her testimony was halting and often interrupted by tears, but she maintained that Schmidt resembled the man she had seen that terrible night. However, under cross-examination, she admitted that the lighting had been poor and that she had been terrified, calling into question the reliability of her identification. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a guilty verdict. Schmidt was sentenced to death, though he continued to maintain his innocence until his execution in early 1912. His final words, spoken to a local minister, were reportedly a continued denial of guilt and a warning that the real killer remained free. The execution of Johann Schmidt brought a sense of closure to Tacoma's traumatized communities, but questions lingered about whether justice had truly been served. No more axe murders occurred in the immediate area after Schmidt's arrest, lending credence to the belief that the right man had been caught. However, some investigators privately harbored doubts about the strength of the evidence, and similar crimes continued to be reported in other parts of the Pacific Northwest. Detective Murphy, who had dedicated months of his life to solving the case, never fully convinced himself of Schmidt's guilt. In private correspondence discovered years later, He expressed concerns about the circumstantial nature of the evidence and the pressure from city officials to find a suspect quickly. The murders had damaged Tacoma's reputation as a safe community for immigrants, and there was considerable political pressure to resolve the case. The Tacoma Axe Killer case represents a fascinating glimpse into early 20th century American law enforcement and the challenges of investigating serial crimes in an era before modern forensic techniques. The murders terrorized a community, destroyed families, and left lasting scars on survivors like Elena Petrov, who never fully recovered from the trauma of that April night. What makes this case particularly compelling is its place in the broader context of American immigration history. The victims were all families who had crossed oceans seeking opportunity and safety in America, only to fall prey to violence that shattered their dreams and their community's sense of security. The fear generated by these crimes affected not just the immediate victims, but entire ethnic communities who suddenly found themselves viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. The case also highlights the limitations of early forensic science and the reliance on circumstantial evidence that characterized many criminal prosecutions of the era. Without fingerprints, DNA evidence, or sophisticated crime scene analysis, investigators like Detective Murphy had to rely on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and intuition to solve crimes that would be far more straightforward to investigate today. Perhaps most haunting is the question of whether Johann Schmidt was truly guilty of these horrific crimes. The execution of a potentially innocent man adds another layer of tragedy to a case already marked by unspeakable violence and community trauma. The doubt expressed by investigators in the continued occurrence of similar crimes in the region suggests that the real Tacoma Axe Killer may have escaped justice entirely. The legacy of the Tacoma Axe Killer murders extends beyond the immediate tragedy of the deaths. These crimes occurred during a period of significant anti-immigrant sentiment in America, and the targeting of immigrant families fed into existing prejudices and fears. The case serves as a reminder of how violence can be used to terrorize entire communities, and how the fear generated by such crimes can have lasting social and political consequences. Elena Petrov, the sole survivor, lived with the trauma of that night for the rest of her life. She eventually married and had children of her own, but family members reported that she never fully recovered from witnessing the murder of her family. Her survival testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, yet the burden of that responsibility weighed heavily on her throughout her life. The Tacoma Axe Killer case remains one of the most chilling chapters in the Pacific Northwest's criminal history, a reminder that evil can strike even in the most peaceful communities, and that the pursuit of justice is often complicated by the limitations of evidence and the pressure of public fear. Whether Johann Schmidt was truly the killer or simply a convenient scapegoat may never be known with certainty, but the impact of these crimes on the families, communities, and investigators involved reverberates through history as a testament to both human evil and the enduring struggle for justice in America. Story 4: The Lonely Hearts Killer. In the summer of 1956, the classified section of newspapers across America carried a peculiar advertisement that would forever change the landscape of criminal investigation. "Lonely widow seeks companionship," it read, followed by a post office box number. What readers didn't know was that this seemingly innocent plea for human connection would become the calling card of one of the most methodical and chilling serial killers in American history. The story begins not with violence, but with loneliness, a universal human condition that would become both weapon and hunting ground for a predator who understood that desperation makes people vulnerable in ways they never imagined. The 1950s were a time of contradictions in America. While the country basked in post-war prosperity and the promise of suburban dreams, beneath the surface lurked a profound loneliness that gripped millions of Americans. Veterans returned from war changed. Women who had tasted independence during wartime found themselves pushed back into domestic roles. And the rapid pace of modernization left many feeling disconnected from traditional communities. It was into this landscape that Raymond Martinez Fernandez entered, a man whose own loneliness had curdled into something far more dangerous. Born in Hawaii to Spanish parents, Fernandez had served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. But it was a head injury sustained in 1945, when a hatch cover fell on him during a storm at sea, that many would later point to as the moment when something fundamental shifted in his psyche. After the accident, Fernandez complained of severe headaches and claimed to have developed psychic abilities. More disturbing were the personality changes noticed by those who knew him. The once gregarious sailor became manipulative, calculating, and obsessed with the occult. He began to see himself as a practitioner of voodoo, someone who could bend others to his will through supernatural means. But Fernandez's real power lay not in mysticism, but in his uncanny ability to read people, particularly lonely, vulnerable women seeking connection in an increasingly isolating world. By 1947, Fernandez had discovered what would become his signature hunting method, the Lonely Hearts columns. These classified advertisements, published in newspapers and magazines across the country, were filled with the desperate pleas of widows, spinsters, and divorced women seeking companionship, marriage, or simply someone to talk to. Fernandez began responding to these advertisements with carefully crafted letters that demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of what these women needed to hear. He claimed to be a successful businessman, a war hero, a man of means looking for genuine love rather than casual companionship. His letters were passionate, articulate, and perfectly calibrated to appeal to each woman's specific vulnerabilities. What made Fernandez particularly dangerous was his patience. He would correspond with multiple women simultaneously, sometimes for months, building elaborate fictional personas and deep emotional connections before ever meeting them in person. By the time he appeared at their doorsteps, these women felt they knew him intimately. They trusted him completely. The first confirmed victim was Jane Thompson, a 66-year-old widow from Albany, New York. Fernandez had been corresponding with her for 8 months when he finally visited her home in December 1947. Thompson had told friends she was planning to marry her pen pal, a successful businessman who had promised to take care of her in her golden years. When Thompson's neighbors noticed she hadn't been seen for several days, they called the police. They found her body in her bedroom, apparently dead from a heart attack. The only odd detail was that her life savings, nearly $6,000 in cash and bonds, had disappeared, along with her mysterious suitor. The death was ruled natural causes. After all, Thompson was elderly and had a history of heart problems. There was no sign of violence, no indication of foul play. If investigators had looked more carefully, they might have noticed the small puncture mark behind her left ear, or the faint smell of almonds that still lingered in the bedroom. Instead, they filed their report and moved on to other cases. Fernandez had discovered something crucial. Elderly women who died apparently natural deaths rarely warranted extensive investigation, especially if they lived alone and had no close family to ask uncomfortable questions. For nearly 2 years, Fernandez operated alone, leaving a trail of mysterious deaths and missing persons across the northeastern United States. But in 1948, he encountered someone who would transform his solitary predation into something far more sinister: Martha Beck. Beck answered one of Fernandez's Lonely Hearts advertisements, and their first meeting should have been routine, another lonely widow for him to manipulate and rob. But Beck was different. Where his other victims saw a romantic fantasy, Beck saw a kindred spirit. She recognized the darkness in Fernandez because she carried her own shadows. Beck had been married to a bus driver who died in a workplace accident, leaving her alone with 2 young children and crushing debt. But her loneliness went deeper than circumstance. Beck had spent her entire life feeling unwanted, unloved, and invisible. She was overweight in an era that prized feminine delicacy, intelligent in a time that discouraged female ambition, and desperately hungry for any form of affection or validation. When Fernandez arrived at her apartment in Pensacola, Florida, expecting to find another easy mark, he instead encountered someone who saw through his carefully constructed facade and didn't care. Beck didn't want the successful businessman he pretended to be. She wanted the dangerous man he actually was. Their relationship moved with shocking speed. Within weeks, Beck had abandoned her children to social services and moved north to join Fernandez. But rather than being horrified by his criminal activities, she became an enthusiastic participant. Beck had found her purpose, and it was terrifying in its intensity. Together, they refined Fernandez's methods into something approaching an art form. Beck would pose as his sister, accompanying him on visits to potential victims. Her presence made Fernandez appear more trustworthy. After all, what kind of dangerous man travels with his sister? Beck also provided emotional intelligence that Fernandez sometimes lacked, helping to identify each victim's specific psychological vulnerabilities. But Beck brought something else to the partnership: jealousy so consuming it bordered on pathological. She couldn't bear to watch Fernandez romance other women, even as part of their criminal enterprise. This jealousy would ultimately prove to be their downfall, but not before they had claimed numerous additional victims. With Beck as his partner, Fernandez's operation became more sophisticated and far more deadly. They developed a system that was methodical, efficient, and absolutely ruthless. Beck would help research potential victims, screening Lonely Hearts advertisements for women who seemed particularly vulnerable, recent widows with substantial assets, elderly spinsters with no close family, isolated women who had mentioned their financial security in their letters. Fernandez would then begin his courtship, but now with Beck's input on every letter, every gift, every calculated gesture of affection. They studied their victims like scientists, noting their fears, desires, habits, and weaknesses. By the time Fernandez arranged to visit, they knew exactly how to manipulate each woman. The visits followed a pattern. Fernandez would arrive as the devoted suitor, often with Beck introduced as his sister who happened to be traveling with him. They would stay in the victim's home, allowing them to observe routines, locate valuables, and identify the best opportunities for theft or murder. Some victims were simply robbed and abandoned, left alive but financially ruined. But increasingly, Fernandez and Beck chose to eliminate witnesses entirely. They became experts at staging deaths that appeared natural or accidental, heart attacks induced by carefully administered drugs, falls down stairs, drownings in bathtubs. Their victim count during this period remains uncertain, as many of their crimes were never officially connected to them. But investigators later estimated they may have been responsible for as many as 20 deaths across multiple states. One of their most audacious crimes involved Myrtle Young, a 60-year-old widow from Green Forest, Arkansas. Young had inherited a substantial farm from her deceased husband and was looking for companionship in her later years. Fernandez courted her for nearly a year through letters before arranging to visit with his sister, Martha. The trio lived together on Young's farm for 3 months, during which time Fernandez convinced Young to sign over her property to him and withdraw her substantial life savings from the bank. When Young began to have second thoughts about the arrangement, Beck smothered her with a pillow while Fernandez held her down. They buried Young's body in her own apple orchard and remained on the farm for another 2 weeks, selling off livestock and equipment before disappearing entirely. Young's death wasn't discovered until the following spring, when new property owners found her remains while planting trees. By early 1949, Fernandez and Beck had grown overconfident. Their success had made them sloppy, and Beck's jealousy had become an increasingly volatile factor in their operations. The beginning of their end came in the form of Janet Fay, a 66-year-old widow from Albany, New York. Fay was different from their usual victims in several crucial ways. She was more suspicious by nature, more connected to her community, and had adult children who maintained regular contact with her. When Fernandez arrived to court her, Fay was initially charmed but quickly became wary of certain inconsistencies in his story. More problematically, Fay was genuinely attractive and vivacious despite her age, and Fernandez found himself actually attracted to her in a way that drove Beck into a frenzy of jealousy. During their stay at Fay's home, Beck became increasingly unstable, making scenes and demanding that they rob the woman and leave immediately. The situation came to a head on January 4th, 1949, when Beck walked into the living room to find Fernandez kissing Fay. In a rage, Beck attacked the older woman with a hammer, striking her repeatedly in the head. Fernandez, rather than stopping the assault, helped finish the job by strangling Fay with a scarf. But killing Fay was only the beginning of their problems. Her adult daughter had been expecting a phone call that evening, and when Fay didn't answer, she immediately became suspicious. She knew her mother had been corresponding with a man named Charles Martin, one of Fernandez's aliases, and that he was supposed to be visiting. Rather than fleeing immediately, Fernandez and Beck made a crucial error. They decided to remain in Fay's house for several days, hoping to stage the scene to look like a natural death or accident. During this time, they forged checks, stole valuables, and even answered phone calls from Fay's concerned relatives, claiming she was ill and couldn't come to the phone. The deception couldn't last. When Faye's daughter arrived unannounced at the house 3 days later, she found signs of a struggle and immediately called the police. By then, Fernandez and Beck had fled, but they had left behind a wealth of evidence: fingerprints, forged documents, and witnesses who had seen them in the area. With police across multiple states now actively hunting them, Fernandez and Beck should have disappeared entirely. Instead, driven by their compulsions and running low on money, they decided to attempt one final score. They targeted Delphine Downing, a 41-year-old widow from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who had been corresponding with Fernandez for several months. Downing was particularly vulnerable. She was recently widowed, financially struggling, and desperate for companionship. She also had a 2-year-old daughter, Raynell, which should have made her an unsuitable target for criminals trying to avoid attention. But Fernandez and Beck were beyond rational decision-making at this point. They were driven by compulsion, addiction to the thrill of manipulation and murder, and Beck's increasingly unstable mental state. They arrived at Downing's home in February 1949, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Downing was more emotionally needy than their usual victims, clinging to Fernandez and talking constantly about marriage and their future together. This behavior triggered Beck's jealousy to an unprecedented degree. The presence of young Raynell complicated everything. The child was loud, demanding attention, and made it impossible for them to operate with their usual stealth. Beck, who had abandoned her own children without apparent remorse, seemed particularly disturbed by Raynell's presence. On February 28, 1949, while Fernandez was out of the house running errands, Beck's frustration reached a breaking point. She later claimed that Downing had been suspicious of their relationship and was threatening to call the police. In reality, Beck had simply reached the limits of her ability to watch Fernandez with another woman. Beck struck Downing with a hammer, similar to her attack on Janet Faye, but Downing didn't die immediately. Instead, she lay groaning and semi-conscious for several hours, while Beck waited for Fernandez to return. When Fernandez arrived home to find Downing dying on the floor, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than seeking medical help or fleeing, he finished what Beck had started, shooting Downing twice in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. But their nightmare was far from over. Raynell had witnessed the entire incident, and she wouldn't stop crying for her mother. The child's wails could be heard throughout the neighborhood, and neighbors had already begun asking questions about the sounds coming from the Downing house. In perhaps their most horrific act, Fernandez and Beck decided they had no choice but to eliminate the only witness to their crime. Beck drowned 2-year-old Raynell in the bathtub, while Fernandez held her down. The murder of Delphine Downing and her daughter marked the end of Fernandez and Beck's killing spree, though they didn't know it yet. Downing's neighbors had noticed the absence of the usually visible mother and child, and the strange comings and goings of the mysterious visitors. When police performed a welfare check on March 1, 1949, they found Fernandez and Beck still in the house, attempting to clean up evidence of their crimes. The bodies of Downing and Raynell were discovered buried in the basement, hastily covered with cement that hadn't yet dried. The arrest was almost anticlimactic after the violence that had led to it. Fernandez and Beck surrendered without resistance, seeming almost relieved that their run was finally over. In custody, they began talking almost immediately, each blaming the other for the escalation to murder, while simultaneously professing their undying love. The confessions that followed would reveal the true scope of their crimes and shock investigators who had initially believed they were dealing with a simple murder case. As the details emerged, police departments across the country began reopening cases involving mysterious deaths of lonely women who had been involved with men they had met through classified advertisements. The trial of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck began in the summer of 1949 and immediately captured national attention. The press dubbed them the Lonely Hearts Killers, and their story became a sensation that combined elements of romance, true crime, and social commentary on the isolation of modern life. The prosecution presented a methodical case that detailed not just the murders in Michigan, but the broader pattern of fraud, theft, and suspected murders across multiple states. They painted Fernandez as a calculating predator who had exploited the loneliness of vulnerable women for years, and Beck as his willing accomplice whose jealousy had escalated their crimes to murder. The defense attempted to portray both defendants as mentally ill, Fernandez as a man whose personality had been fundamentally altered by his head injury, and Beck as a woman driven to madness by abandonment and desperation. They argued that neither defendant was truly responsible for their actions, having been consumed by forces beyond their control. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the brutality of their final crimes, particularly the murder of 2-year-old Raynell Downing, had turned public opinion completely against them. The trial became less about determining guilt than about understanding how two people could descend so completely into evil. During the trial, both defendants continued to profess their love for each other, even as they blamed each other for their crimes. Beck wrote passionate love letters to Fernandez from her jail cell, while he attempted to present himself as a victim of her overwhelming jealousy and possessiveness. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Both defendants were sentenced to death in the electric chair, a sentence that reflected both the heinous nature of their crimes and society's desire for final justice. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were executed at Sing Sing Prison on March 8, 1951, within minutes of each other. Their deaths marked the end of one of the most unusual and disturbing partnerships in criminal history. Fernandez went to his death maintaining his innocence of the worst charges, claiming that while he had engaged in fraud and theft, he had never intended to become a killer. Beck, in contrast, seemed to find a strange peace in her final days, writing in her diary that she was ready to die because she had finally found someone who loved her, even if that love had led them both to destruction. The case of the Lonely Hearts Killers left lasting impacts on American society and law enforcement. It highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals in an increasingly disconnected world and led to greater scrutiny of classified advertisement services. Police departments began sharing information more effectively about cases involving traveling criminals who targeted specific victim profiles. But perhaps most importantly, the case served as a dark mirror to the American dream of the 1950s. Beneath the surface, prosperity and suburban contentment lurked profound loneliness and desperation that predators could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Lonely Hearts columns continued to operate for decades after Fernandez and Beck's execution, but they were never quite the same. The innocent hope for connection that had once characterized these advertisements was forever tainted by the knowledge of what could happen when loneliness met evil. In the years that followed, investigators would continue to uncover cases potentially linked to Fernandez and Beck. The true number of their victims may never be known, as many of their suspected crimes involved elderly victims whose deaths were initially attributed to natural causes. The case remains relevant today as society grapples with new forms of isolation and new technologies that can be exploited by predators. The internet has replaced Lonely Hearts columns, but the fundamental human need for connection and the vulnerability that creates remains unchanged. The story of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the mask of exactly what we most desperately need: love, understanding, and the promise that we are not alone in the world. Their victims died not because they were foolish or careless, but because they were human beings seeking human connection in a world that had left them isolated and forgotten. In the end, the Lonely Hearts Killers succeeded not because they were particularly clever or skilled, but because they understood a fundamental truth about human nature, that loneliness can make us willing to trust, to hope, and to believe in promises that seem too good to be true. They weaponized the very thing that makes us most human, our need for love and connection, and used it to destroy the lives of innocent people whose only crime was wanting to feel less alone. The legacy of their crimes lives on as a dark cautionary tale about the price of isolation and the predators who hunt in the shadows of human loneliness, always ready to offer exactly what desperate hearts most need to hear. So close your eyes, let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift out, they dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.